Hello. In this video, we will look at the three forms of Gothic art from European culture. French Gothic, which is the start and progenitor of Gothic art, and then as it spreads from France throughout Northern Europe, a specific look at German and English examples, and then the influence of the Gothic in Italy, which many scholars don't really refer to as a Gothic period, but more just an extension of the late medieval in Italy. Gothic art is a response to some of the social pressures and changes that are happening in the 12th century. The European society is changing due to a number of factors. After the end of the final crusade, major crusade to retake Jerusalem and the Holy Land, the much of Europe was feeling economic pressure due to the cost of the Crusades over the previous several generations, and then also the effect that the Crusades and several pandemic plagues had on society at large. In several places, up to as much as 1/3 of the adult population had died as a result of plagues, and so people were very nervous about what was happening and about foreigners and about what they saw as the effects of the plagues and of the Crusades. It was a chaotic time. It was a difficult time in European society, and as such, they looked to the church and to their governments for answers and support and leadership. And the feudal system that had been in place for several centuries by this point had led a small segment of the population, the nobility and the elite, to become very wealthy and live reasonably luxurious lives and really take the lead in art and culture. But the vast majority of the people lived much the same way they had, and it really didn't, the system did not allow for a great deal of upward mobility or development of wealth. So it wasn't until some changes happened that allowed the rise of a new, reasonably wealthy middle class or upper middle class that wasn't nobility but had wealth. And the major change that caused that was the rise of the financial and banking system as a result of the lack of a central government or leadership in much of Europe, especially in France. In France, because of France's location as sort of a part of Central Europe and a part of Northern Europe, because of its its coasts and its access to both the Atlantic and then close proximity to the Mediterranean, and because of its traditions of trade and the routes of trade established by pilgrims and crusaders traveling from Northern Europe to the south, France became strategically positioned to become an economic power, and several major developments in France's economy led to the rise of what was known as the nouveau riche. These are newly wealthy people who are not landed gentry, and their wealth is not generated by land per se. Their wealth is generated by business and economy and finance. And these people became wealthy, and they really drove culture forward. They didn't want a continuation of the Romanesque or of the medieval. They wanted something new, and they wanted to try and position themselves and France as a whole more at the forefront, at the leadership of culture. Italy had dominated culture for several hundred years, and Rome at the center. But even in Italy, other cities became important as centers of both economy and of culture. Florence, Milan became important centers because of their strategic locations on trade routes. And so, as such, these cities are going to rise to challenge Rome for not only for the social lead and political lead and economic lead, but for the cultural lead. A city's identity was tied up in its iconic structures, in its culture, and if you had the wealthiest city, you also wanted to have the most cultured city. You wanted to attract visitors because of your structures, your beautiful buildings, your beautiful churches, cathedrals, palaces, public works, squares, all of those things. And so, as such, during the Gothic, uh, this gives rise, this sort of rivalry between cities gives rise to this new style. Now, the new style of Gothic is also a reflection of the churches and and social response to the previous generations and what was seen as kind of a dark period in our history. And the Gothic is an attempt to show that we've come out of that, and we've come out of that into an age of transcendence. That was really the theme. This idea of transcendence was the major theme of the Gothic. That while life wasn't always pleasant, that you could overcome the unpleasantness through an intense spirituality and an intense focus on the future rather than a look to the past. Now, it's not always the case that we have an individual to kind of point to and say, this is the progenitor, this is the leader. But in this case of the Gothic in France, there is one person who seems very instrumental, and that's a man by the name of Abbot Suger. Suger was a priest who was from a wealthier family, and he was named the abbot at Saint Denis, which was an old Romanesque church just at kind of the edge of Paris. It was a very typical Romanesque style church, very big and austere and kind of dark. And when Suger came to Saint Denis, he was a little disappointed because he had been a member, an active member at court in Paris, and he really felt like that he was being kind of pushed aside and shunned and put at this out of the way church, this old dark church. And so he set about raising money to renovate Saint Denis in this new style, or what he was hoping would be a new style. Now, Saint Denis originally was built like many Romanesque churches. It was big. It didn't and bulky and very fortress-like, and it didn't have a lot of ornamentation or decoration. So what Suger wanted was to add decorative elements, to not completely rebuild the church, but basically take the body, the structure that was there, and augment it and adjust it to fit a new style. So one of the things that was the detractors and negatives that was seen as the Romanesque style was that the churches were very dark on the interior. So to change that, they wanted to add windows. Well, if you add windows, windows not being structural, you need to somehow support these big heavy structures, especially the roofs, which are very heavy. And so what you need are a system of supports, either attached supports, like you see here across the front. Those are known as either pilasters or buttresses. And those attached supports allow for more of the wall to be window and still have enough support for the roof. Now, the buttresses will take many forms. They can be attached to the wall itself, or they can be separate from the wall and support the wall and the roof through armature structures. And then when that's the case, those are known as flying buttresses. Now, Suger didn't change the floor plan or the overall structure of the church. He just simply adjusted, and when necessary, he removed elements or changed elements to fit this new style. Whenever you see on a church or a structure that's transitional between Romanesque and Gothic, whenever you see a curved arch like you see at the portal entrances or above the doorway here, those arches are typical Romanesque. The Roman style arch was curved at the top, and the Gothic arch, as it will come to be known, is more pointed. So none of the arches on the facade of this church are truly Gothic. They're headed that way. The long, slender arch is Gothic, but a true Gothic style arch will be pointed at the top rather than curved. Now, the other element on the facade here that he added was the portal entry, the accentuated and embellished entry with multiple layers of sculpture, relief carvings, and then above the doorway, the rose window, that circular window with the frame in the shape of the petals that makes it look like a flower. On the interior, by adding all these windows, by using stained glass, which is another key element of the French Gothic, the experience on the interior of the church is much brighter and lighter. And that's supposed to make the viewer, the visitor, feel more uplifted and give them that feeling of transcendence. It really did change the way that people experienced the church itself, but also how they felt about overall society and how they felt about the church, that the church wasn't this dark, oppressive institution, that the church was interested in the way that the people felt and wanted to inspire them to a higher sense of belief. Now, we'll talk about the stained glass in particular in a minute, but the important element that you see on the interior here is that all of that colored glass, the light filtering through it, it creates an atmosphere inside that is warmer and brighter than in previous generations. Now, new structures after Saint-Denis were heavily inspired by this new spirit of creativity, of openness, of uplifting spirit, rather than kind of dark and fortress-like. Another important change in the Gothic is the really moving away from Roman control throughout all of Europe as far as the church goes. The church through the medieval, had been very forceful in its control of doctrine throughout Europe in terms of church, but also subject matter and theme and what was acceptable. And now, as the farther away from Rome you get, the less that control is going to be felt or followed. So in France in particular, but in Germany and England as well, we're going to see that segment of the church, that body of the church, feel more freedom to be creative in the way that they build churches and cathedrals. They don't have to just mimic what they see as this old Romanesque style. Now, that freedom and creativity, the closer you get to Rome, is felt less and less. And in fact, we won't see any really new Roman structures during the Gothic. There are no important new structures built in Rome until much later in the Renaissance. This is Chartres Cathedral. Chartres is an important cathedral because it really establishes the high mark for the use of stained glass and windows and buttressing and design and exploration and creativity in the French Gothic. There, there are more than 200 principal windows. There's 4 major rose windows. There's more than a dozen large flying buttresses that support the roof to allow for the almost all of the length of the nave and the transepts to be covered with windows. There's the large uh, facade, the focus on the facade, that the front entry to the church, moving the tower away from above the altar, which was common in Romanesque, where the transepts cross, to the facade. There's 2 towers. You'll notice that they're not symmetrical. They're not the same design. That's part of the spirit of Gothic, to allow for creativity and exploration, and that it doesn't have to be so uh, so symmetrical or so closed in its design. It could be a little bit freer, and we'll see that throughout. That the Gothic really has a spirit of exploration, and that's important because creativity had not been an important part of art. Artists were seen as laborers, skilled laborers, but laborers, and their job was to basically do whatever the patron requested, and so that was what was important. But now in the Gothic, we're going to see this opening, this loosening of those bonds, and that's important. Now, on the interior of Chartres, or as you enter, you'll go through this portal that has, you notice the pointed arches of the Gothic. It still has the tympanum relief carving, and the subject matter is still the same that it's been throughout the Romanesque, the Christ returning in Last Judgment. And then there's uh, an overabundance of decorative details. There's multiple layers of relief carvings. There's row upon row of saints, and those that stand to around the entry and that stand above the entry to the doors. That embellishment is an important theme. Now, when we hear the word Gothic, we tend to think about the more recent iteration of it, which came at the end of the Baroque during the Romantic period, where um, it really wasn't as important of a visual period as it was in literature and other art forms. But this is not at all that kind of darker feel of that Gothic. This Gothic is intended to be uplifting. It's intended to be brighter and lighter. As you enter the church, what you're supposed to see is this, or feel, is this overwhelming awe at that man could build such amazing structures. And that's important because society got during the medieval period had felt like a lot of people had felt like society was failing, like we were um, not able to do the great things that we had been able to do previously. And so this was a sign. Building these churches was a sign that we were, man had returned to our focus, like we had in the classical, of trying to make great things and great structures. This is Notre Dame in Paris. And French Gothic doesn't start in Paris, but I think it finds its greatest expression in Paris. And Paris really tried to be the center of culture. It really wanted to lay claim to being the most important and beautiful city in Europe. Notre Dame is notable for many things. It's a very intricate design. It has not as many windows as Chartres, but the windows and the stained glass is still impressive. The rose window is well, there's multiple, but the 2 large rose windows are 2 of the largest in the world. The tower is incredibly ornate with all these spikes and spires and very textural details, and that becomes kind of influential. That'll be copied later. The facade is a little bit more traditional. It's not quite as flamboyant, although and it's a little bit more symmetrical than others, but it's that's sort of a reflection. Initially, as um, as Gothic style kind of takes over and people start to kind of practice it and follow it. There's some people who think that it's a little too flamboyant, a little too risky, and so with Notre Dame, the designer and the architects and builders wanted to create something that didn't take too big of a risk, so it still has some of those more conservative Romanesque elements, but in its interior and its feel and its scale and it is and the way that it uses light and height and design on the interior. In the nave, you see this very dramatic effect, and that's what it was going for. The Gothic really is about drama and to create a sense of drama again in architecture. Now, in Paris, during the 12th century, there's this rise of this newly wealthy upper middle class, and that are not nobility. They don't have title, but they have money. And in fact, some of these people became fabulously wealthy. Some of the wealthiest people in the world, and they expressed that wealth by doing what they saw the nobility do. They kind of think, okay, well, what do we do with the wealth? Well, we do what wealthy people do, which is build lavish homes and in new styles, and we do things that they do. And so one of these newly wealthy was a man by the name of Jacques Coeur. Coeur was a businessman. He was a financier. He was a capitalist. Um, he was involved in shipping and trade and lots of different kinds of businesses all throughout Europe. And he had traveled. But he was not a nobleman. And so, and he was sort of the leader of this new group of nouveau riche. And what he and his friends decided was that they were going to enjoy their wealth, but also they saw what was happening in Paris, and that as Paris became a larger and larger city, that there was, that they didn't want to spend all their time in Paris. Paris was getting crowded and large and cramped, and especially, in the summer. So Coeur looked for a place, a retreat to escape to, and settled on building himself a home, and others followed suit in a small village south of Paris called Bourges. And this is really the rise of, which you might have heard before, the bourgeoisie. These are wealthy individuals who are expressing that wealth through building these large homes and living how they see the nobility live. Now, in Bourges, Coeur builds not really a palatial kind of structure. It's not quite as large. I mean, it's large, but it's not a palace. That it's not rivaling the king, but it is a very large structure. The facade that you see there has some very Gothic details. Has a tower and a spires and the pointed roof structure and corbelled arches, and corbelled pediments and all the windows across the front. And so he's kind of showing showing off to the street this exterior that rivals, this in style, the Gothic structures, but it's the overall design that's quite unique and interesting. This is built very much like a Roman villa, where it's around a central courtyard. The image on the left is actually on the interior. It faces, the house sort of wraps around this courtyard area, and it faces the interior as much as the exterior, because the whole idea of the house was for entertaining. This courtyard area could be used for parties and picnics and balls and all kinds of various forms of entertaining, and the house wrapped around it. And so anywhere in the house, if you were upstairs in one of the bedrooms, or if you were downstairs in the dining area or the parlors, that you could look out through these windows on the courtyard area and feel like it was one big entertainment space. And that was really what these houses were for. Part of how Coeur and his social circle did business was not necessarily in a business setting. They didn't, they would have social gatherings and make business deals and make arrangements and agreements at those gatherings. So this really became the way that uh, French society and Paris society operated. And these individuals, because of their wealth, because of their desire to be new, to not be like the old style, they really pushed culture forward much more quickly. So they're going to be the ones who invest in the decorative objects, who invest in art, who buy paintings, who collect sculpture, who collect books and manuscript, who allow for, they use their wealth to sort of restart culture in Europe. Now, in terms of the two-dimensional decorative arts, painting and sculpture in 3 dimensions during the Gothic, stained glass is clearly the most important. Um, the painting will be renewed and revived in Italy, but in France, it's very clearly stained glass. These are some of the stained glass windows from Chartres Cathedral. Chartres is famous for having perhaps the highest number of stained glass panels and windows, but and the quality is very high. But you could argue that some of the other churches and structures have higher quality, and we'll look at one in a minute. Now, what makes these images, these panels so unique is the just the sheer number of them. There's 200 windows, and each window is some of the windows are as large as the rose windows, 35 feet across. Some of the pointed arched windows are 25 feet high and 8 to 9 feet across. And I mean, these are some really, really large windows. But when you get up close, you see that um, they're made from relatively small pieces of glass that are cut to fit those shapes and then leaded together. So thin strips of lead, which is a very soft metal, are placed in between the different pieces of cut glass. The glass is colored uh, before it's put in place, or actually the glass is colored while it's made. And this is all blown glass, not sheet glass, so it's a very labor-intensive process. This is not the work of any one individual. There's dozens of artisans at work here to create these glass panels at various stages of the process. There's glass blowers, there's glass cutters and polishers, there's the glass artists making the actual stained glass panels. They're also doing the staining. The staining of stained glass is not the color, it's the added painted details that then have to be heated and reinforced, and then the leading that must be then burnished and cured. It's a very, very labor-intensive process. So even a small panel that's just maybe 3 feet by 3 feet could take, depending upon its intricacy, could take an artist anywhere from 2 to 4 weeks to complete. And there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of panels that size. So we're talking about years, generations of artists working on these glass panels. Now, when you get up close, you can really see the level of detail that these artists were able to get. Each different colored piece of colored glass, each different shape is chosen to create the overall and cut to create the overall shape of the figures, the background, and then to get the added details of the modeling, the folds on the fabric, and the facial details and expressions. All of that has to be painted by hand. That's the actual staining of the glass, and then each piece is cured. So you can see how really intricate and complicated the process is and the designs are. Chartres sets this standard, but then as other churches, even within Paris, and they want to rival Chartres for its quality, we really see that stained glass evolves as an art form, but it's a short-lived evolution. By the time of the Renaissance, it's going to be completely replaced with painting. Stained glass is very important and will continue to be important, but it has its limitations. There's only one limitation is just the sheer amount of labor and time that it takes to create. By rival, or by comparison, I should say, an oil painting that might take a few weeks, maybe a couple of months to complete, whereas one stained glass window could take several months to fully complete. This is Sainte-Chapelle. Sainte-Chapelle's famous. It's a small chapel in Paris, kind of tucked away, hidden in and around in a back alley almost, but it's extraordinarily high quality glass, and it's famous because, for one thing, almost all of the interior walls are glass. The roof structure is held up by buttresses on the exterior, and basically the entire interior is glass wall. And it's the quality of the glass. I mean, it's not as many windows here as there are in Chartres because it's a smaller chapel, but it's the quality of each individual panel is really, really remarkable. The number of pieces, the size of those pieces, the shaping and polishing of those pieces, and then the staining of those pieces. The attention to detail, that's what's really, really special at Sainte-Chapelle, is that these windows have an incredible attention to detail. The rose window is perhaps the most intricately carved stone frame for the window. It's really, really remarkable in it feels very fluid in the way that the stone works, and just, I mean, amazing that they were able to use such great skill to create these objects. Now, as you get up close, you notice that there's a repetitive pattern in the background that, it doesn't seem as like such a big deal that pattern doesn't. But when you realize that that's all made by hand repetitively, all of those small little bell acorn shapes have to be exactly the same. The surrounds have to be exactly the same. It's not like taking one big piece of glass and painting it. It's all pieces, and to put all those pieces together perfectly to create that pattern is really, really remarkable. Even when you get up really, really close to what would seem like just a almost insignificant level of detail. So this is a small, it's only about 9 inches, 10 inches across, roundel. It's tucked away. It's not an important, glass panel. It's almost like out of the way. But when you get up close, you notice that it has an amazing level of detail. Each piece is very, very small. I mean, so the hem on the garments these are really little pieces, but even those have been detailed. They've adding these textures, adding these patterns, adding these to get that really high level of sophistication and detailing. And that's ultimately what makes Sainte-Chapelle such an amazing work. Now, as Gothic spreads out from France, it moves first through what had been the Carolingian Empire, Charlemagne's empire from the medieval, through Germany and England, and then its effects are felt in Italy and in other places, but not nearly as powerfully. Gothic, as it spreads, is going to encourage the whole Gothic spirit encourages exploration and creativity, and there really isn't one way to do it. There are certain elements that you expect with a Gothic style church. You expect pointed arches, you expect rose windows, you expect buttressing, you expect stained glass, you expect certain things, but that doesn't mean that they have to be expressed all in the same way. Now, The in this church, this is Salisbury Cathedral, and Salisbury is remarkable because of its sheer size and scale. I mean, it really keeps that Romanesque feel of big and scale being important. But it doesn't, one of the things you'll notice is it doesn't have the same front facade emphasis. It doesn't have two towers on the front. It doesn't have rose windows. It doesn't have some of the details that we would think of with Gothic. It still has this central tower over the apse. It still has the attached supports, buttresses and pilasters instead of flying. It's not quite as complicated or intricate. The interior still has sort of an austere feel, a simplified feel, the ribbed groin vaults, but instead of those being based upon a a circular uh, arch, they're based upon the pointed arch. There is stained glass, but not as much of it. And it really is sort of a hybrid between the Romanesque and the Gothic. In Germany, instead of seeing um, the pure French Gothic, we see uh, a little bit of both. You know, it's got an emphasis on the facade. It has two towers, but it's very symmetrical. It's very sharp, and the decoration on the surface is very, very elaborate. It's imposing. It's overwhelming, really. And then there's the intricacy and complex nature of the design, especially the buttressing. You can see on the back around the circular apse, there's buttresses upon buttresses, and it's very, very overwhelming to the viewer. On the interior, it still has some of that very similar kind of austere feel. Instead of they didn't use stained glass because that wasn't common in their time. They instead focused on sculpture details because they used sculpture in Germany, um, and specific things that they were trying to explore that were common for them. The sacristy that was used to house the sacred elements was made from about 4,000 pounds of pure gold, and it's very much like a medieval reliquary. And the bell that was cast, the largest bell ever cast from iron and extraordinarily heavy. You can see that's a person standing beneath it. It's in fact rare that they even ring it because they're worried that if they ring it, one, because it's so old that the metal might shatter. Metal as it gets cast iron as it gets older, it gets brittle. But also just that the sound could shake apart its its structural supports, and if it collapsed because it's extraordinarily heavy, it could do a great deal of damage. But this is the kind of thing, you know, they wanted to make it bigger, they wanted to make it better, they wanted to make it more luxurious. Now, the other art form in Germany that was popular was this wood carving, which in the medieval and Romanesque, wood carving had been important, but this is going to express this new kind of romantic, expressive style in the Gothic, and they're really focusing on trying to be dramatic. And so these are actually referred to sometimes as grotesques because they are overwhelmingly like this is a pietà, this is Christ taken down from the cross, draped across Mary's lap, he's dead, and the wounds are gross and festering, and he's overwhelmingly thin, and his, you know, they're just really focusing on the uh, trying to elicit from the viewer a dramatic response. You know, they really want you to be moved by the work, and you know, so it's a heightened sense of that. Now, in Italy, it's a different story. It's a different feel. They never really fully embraced the Gothic. They borrowed certain Gothic elements and applied those, but it's really sort of a much more of a continuation of the medieval. This is Orvieto Cathedral, and while it has a distinctive and an impressive facade, there's a lot of those similar elements that you'd see in a French Gothic cathedral. It doesn't really have the separate towers. There's sort of those piers that look kind of like towers, but they're not really towers. It has the a rose window, but it's small. It doesn't have buttressing. It doesn't have an emphasis, an overemphasis on windows. Doesn't use a lot of stained glass. In fact, they tended to favor painting over stained glass. But it's the it's a sort of a nod, an homage to Gothic style. The interior has a very typical Romanesque roof structure. It has frescoes instead of stained glass. It has it's really an emphasis on the materials. Those bands are a mixture, an alternating use of black and pink marble, both very, very rare. So they're showing off the wealth through the quality of the materials. They were expensive. And in the Gothic in Italy, they're bringing back a Roman tradition of painting practice called fresco. And so we're going to really see fresco be the most important decorative style and element in Italian medieval, late medieval or Gothic. In Milan, the cathedral there is the attempt was made to have certain Gothic elements, but really focusing on ornamentation. So the structure is very, very highly decoratively embellished with spears or spires and towers, and all these are all decorative. But overall, underneath all that in the structure, it's basically Romanesque. What if this were the North or this were France, what we might guess at as being buttressing is not. It's really just decorative. It's just adding all those decorative details to a Romanesque structure. The interior, pointed groin vaults, so there's a little bit of that Gothic in there, but overall it still has this sort of darker kind of feel to it. Now, where in France, they would have focused on the stained glass. In Italy, it's going to be a combination of painting and these sculpted altar forms, like you see in the image on the right, in that niche. Those become really popular from the Gothic through the Renaissance. We'll see quite several of those carved and installed in churches and other structures in the Renaissance. In Florence, Florence was a rising city center. Milan was on a trade route, and so they were wealthy because of their shipping and trade. Florence becomes a center for banking. In one of the ways that people in the Gothic, we still do this today, but one of the ways that they tried to make money and increase their wealth and business was by borrowing money to invest in their capital, capital investments in their businesses and then that became an industry. The banking trade became an industry to borrow money and then charge interest and allow the money to make money. And so Florence became one of those centers based for banking. And so they started out the cathedral during the Gothic, built the campanile, the bell tower on the right, and the first 2/3 of the church, the nave. But when they got to the point where they were trying to build that dome on the back over the apse, they tried twice and failed. The dome collapsed. It's such a large dome, and they hadn't built a large-scale dome like that in more than 1,000 years, and so they had to wait until they could find an architect, and it wasn't until the early Renaissance that happened, who was able to come up with a plan. And it wasn't until the till Brunelleschi centered on this idea of using these ribs to reinforce the dome to make it look more pointed, that they were able to build the dome at all. Previous attempts had collapsed. The interior of Florence Cathedral is very similar to the interiors of other Italian late medieval cathedrals. It's sort of austere and simple. It's focusing on the design of the architecture rather than on a lot of surface embellishment or a lot of stained glass. Now, what takes the place of stained glass in Italy is painting. And painting, there's, just like Suger is sort of focused upon as the progenitor of French Gothic, there's one Italian painter who's seen, not that he's the first, but he's really given a tremendous amount of credit as being the father of Renaissance painting. He's a Gothic painter, but many Renaissance painters looked to his paintings and his style for their inspiration. And that's a man by the name of Giotto di Bonadone. Giotto was a fresco painter, and his seminal work was done in this small chapel made kind of interestingly for the Scrivini family. The Scrivinis, many historians equate them to the Gothic version of the mafia. They were not a particularly ethical or moral business family. They had earned their money by loaning money, but charging high interest, and by being willing to do what they felt necessary to get ahead and to be successful. And so as such, in the Gothic, there was this controversial practice of the church by giving indulgences. So if you'd done something that wasn't so moral or ethical, in fact, if you'd sinned to the point where the church said that you were going to be you were going to go to hell, that you could kind of buy your way out of that sin by providing an offering or building a structure or making major donations to the church. And so this whole chapel and its decoration is an indulgence, basically, by the Scrivinis. The exterior is pretty simple, pretty Romanesque. It's kind of regular rectangular structure, nothing very fancy. It's the interior decorations that really shine in this chapel. The lowest level was actually painted, its frescoes painted by Ghirlandaio, who was Giotto's teacher. And then they hired Giotto to execute frescoes from above Ghirlandaio's all along the walls and ceiling. And Giotto was, what makes these frescoes interesting and remarkable is that they are a cycle, what's called a fresco cycle. So he tells a story in a series of panels, very similar to what we would think of, and actually this has a precedent in Roman times. They would do this in relief, but he's replacing the relief with the fresco, with paintings. And so each panel tells a story or a part of the story of Christ's life. And he starts with his nativity, and he tells what he considers to be the important parts, important elements of Christ's story from start to finish through his crucifixion and resurrection. But what's interesting about it is the parts of the story that Giotto chooses and the character of Jesus that he's trying to communicate. Because this isn't Rome, it's in Padua, and because it was not made for the church necessarily, it was made for the Scrivini family, Giotto felt some freedom of creativity to be able to tell the story of Jesus that he wanted to tell rather than just following doctrine or tradition. And he really wanted to show Jesus's humanity, to focus on his humanity. And so as such, in these panels, we'll see things that we'd never seen in painting before. Giotto is also a master of technique. He was very skilled at composition, and we're starting to see a believable perspective, although it's not quite perfect. The linear perspective is better, but it's not perfect. Mary stands up, she's going to be through the roof, but scale and proportion are a little off, but it's getting better. But it's really more in how he uses the figures, how he composes the figures, that makes it more believable, more realistic. We see backs of figures for the first time. We see figures at odd angles, which is more real. For generations, painters had taken the figures and turned them all to the front. They all faced front. They all faced the viewer, and it seemed very formal and stiff and not very lifelike because this is supposed to be a little bit more candid. You think about, okay, the difference between taking a formal portrait and then taking a photograph that documents a scene. And when you do that, not everybody's going to face the camera. Not everybody's going to face forward. It's going to be a bit more disorganized, and that's what Giotto's trying to get into his works. Those figures off to the right, the shepherds, not that they play an important part of the story, and so he wants to include them, but he doesn't have them face us because that doesn't make sense. They were there. They're like us. We can put ourselves in the group with them, look at what they look at, and it helps move the story forward. So this is his version of the Nativity. You see the infant Jesus and Mary underneath the shelter, and Joseph there asleep. Poor Joseph's always depicted asleep, and the angels flying around and singing in the heavens, and the shepherds there witnessing. They're seeing what's going on, and then they'll go back and tell everybody what they saw. Now he makes some really interesting, bold, and kind of radical choices. This is called the Massacre of the Innocents. One, Jesus isn't in it, but it's still telling an important part of Jesus' story. Just after Jesus' birth, Joseph is visited by an angel to say, you need to leave, take Mary and Jesus and leave. Herod wants to kill him, and so this panel tells us that part of the story. Herod is the king is in the tower above, and he looks down and he's giving the order to kill all male infants under the age of 3. Now, the reason why you would include an image in a church, a religious image of infants being killed, is that it really speaks to the nature of sacrifice. That when we hear about the story of Jesus and we hear about, that Herod has all these infants killed and Jesus escapes, everybody's happy about Jesus escaping, but you don't think about the effect that had on the rest of society, and that's ultimately what Giotto wants to do. Is he wants to make Jesus seem more human, but he also wants the viewer to focus on the role of humanity, both in Jesus' story and in today. That we're sometimes awful to each other. We sometimes make decisions that are really terrible, and we do terrible things, and that still happens. And we need to know that about ourselves, and that's what Giotto was wanting us to see. You notice the perspective is getting much better, and the way that the figures overlap, and the way that things in the background are more in proportion. Now, some of those babies are a little out of proportion, but still, overall, we're seeing this development of this painted process, and that's another way that Giotto is going to be influential, is the realism. Some of the decisions that Giotto makes as to which parts of the story, if you were going to tell Jesus' story in just a few images, might seem a little suspect. I think this is Jesus in the temple. This is the only story in Scripture, at least in the Scripture that's been accepted as part of the Gospels, that is sort of set in the middle of Jesus' life. He's supposedly right around 12 years old. He's traveled with his parents and siblings to the temple in Jerusalem to be counted and pay taxes and participate in the annual sort of trip to Jerusalem. And then the story says that they left to travel back to Nazareth, just a few miles walk, but one that they would make is collectively in a group for safety, and they didn't get all the way back. They would have stopped part of the way to camp, and when they got to the camp, Mary and Joseph didn't know where Jesus was, and so they quickly walked the few miles back to Jerusalem to find him. because he had been left behind, and they found him in the temple. And he was speaking with the rabbis, the teachers in the temple, and he was amazing them with his understanding and interpretation of Scripture. And so here, Giotto has imagined this scene where Joseph and Mary they're entering the temple, and they see Jesus, and Mary reaches out to say, like, where, there he is, where have you been? And in the story, just after this moment, again, capturing a moment, freezing time, showing that part of the story. That's what Giotto does well. But Jesus says, "Oh, well, where'd you think I'd be? I would be in my Father's house." And so it's adding to sort of that, oh, well, this is how teenagers act element, and making Jesus seem more human. He chooses. There's several images and panels in the fresco cycle that speak to stories of some of the miracles that Jesus performed, but he also includes the first miracle, which is the turning the water into wine. And I think it's important or the reason he chooses that is because he wants to paint this image of an everyday scene, a family celebrating a wedding, and the relationships, the family relationships. He wants to make Jesus seem more human, more real. He doesn't want to perform the miracle. He tells his mother no, and she just insists, and then he goes ahead and changes the water into wine anyway, even though he tries to tell her it's not his time yet. So I think it's important. Giotto's goal in all of the images is that no one image on its own tells the whole story, that you have to see them all together. So he really saw this collectively as a single work, even though each panel was made and painted separately. Probably the only time in church, anyway, that you'll see a painting of Jesus attacking and getting angry and attacking someone. This is his clearing of the temple, and he gets angry and he attacks the money lenders and chases them out of the temple and turns over their tables, and this is Jesus, being a human being, getting frustrated, and responding normally. And the only time you see that in Scripture, and very rarely would you ever see this in religious imagery. Notice that the perspective is getting much, much better, scale and proportion overlapping, figures come in front of other figures. Giotto is really figuring out, as he flows through this cycle, how to paint, how to render, how to make things believable and modeling in space. This is perhaps the most famous of the panels. It's called the Lamentation. It shows Jesus down from the cross, and it really is a focus on the feeling and emotions felt by those around Jesus after his death. We hadn't seen a lot of expression and emotion in painting, and all the figures were very formal, were very kind of expressionless throughout the medieval. It was not candid. And this is supposed to be candid. It's supposed to be freezing and capturing that moment when this has just taken place, and these people are struggling to respond and to feel their way through their response. And then, of course, he's showing off with those angels and all those different poses that he's figured out, how to do and how to render. No one had ever been able to do anything like that before, and other artists are going to come and study that so that they can then apply it to their works. The final panel is the resurrected Jesus, and he's, again, relationships with Mary, with the other women who've come to they had hastily put him in the tomb, and they wanted to come and actually perform the ritual cleansing and do things the right way to bury the body, and then they find that the tomb is empty. So what Giotto is trying to do with this fresco cycle is to tell the whole story, not in a single image, because you can't do that, but to tell the whole story in multiple images. And he wants you to view it as such. He wants you to view each piece as part of that story. Now, As I mentioned, Giotto becomes known as the father of Renaissance painting, the father of painting in Italy, really, because he's copied, he's mimicked, he's studied. You know, his style of rendering, of using light and dark and modeling, of using shade and shadow and with a variety of colors, adding more detail, the backgrounds, giving a sense of space to the paintings. You start to see a little bit of landscape in the background of his works. Hadn't seen that before. All of that becomes very, very influential as we move into the Renaissance. All right, so the Gothic is the beginning of an evolution of style in Europe and a competition of style in Europe between France and Italy and Northern Europe. And we're going to see that move through the next couple of centuries as we move into the 13th century and the early Renaissance, then on into the 14th and 15th century of the High Renaissance. We'll see the effects, the legacy of the Gothic be experimented through a more classical approach in the Renaissance.